Post-Aristotle Ancient Philosophy, Part 13, Medieval Philosophers. Professor Michael Botwin, Department of Psychology, California State University, Fresno. St. Anselm starts our line of medieval philosophers. This group of individuals are the ones that worked hard to bring Aristotle back into the philosophical fold, and thus Catholic theology. So let's look at how this line of individuals did that. So Anselm comes along and he says, reason and perception should and can supplement faith. Doesn't say it should replace it, but says that reason and perception can supplement faith. Anselm develops something called the ontological argument. If something can be thought of, something must be causing that thought. In Anselm's mind, what was causing thinking was God. So with Anselm, we have the logical deduction of God. And so now you can know God through not only faith, but through reason and logic as well. Our next medieval philosopher is Peter Lombard. He quite didn't make it to sainthood, I don't know why. No ring around his head. But there are three ways to learn from God according to Lombard. We can learn by faith, we can learn by reason, or we could study God's work and the things that God has created. Now this brings a back to nature movement into Catholic theology. Because God created everything, if you study God's work, you study nature. So you can see the Aristotle coming in. Our next medieval philosopher is Peter Abelard. Here you see Peter Abelard with Heloise. They had one of the most famous love stories in all of history. And I'll tell you a little bit about that after I tell you about some of Abelard's ideas. He starts kind of like the ontological argument, and he says, by doubting things, we come to inquiry. Through inquiry, we perceive truth. You can see this doubting will come back when we talk about René Descartes in the Renaissance unit. Abelard translated Aristotle. He was an up-and-coming hotshot philosopher at the University of Notre Dame, which was highly intertwined, as all education was, with the Catholic Church and hence the Notre Dame Cathedral. Abelard went through Christian theology at the time and found 158 contradictions in Christian theology. And he went about trying to reconcile them, or at least show that some of them just simply didn't work. So he looked at arguments and counter-arguments to clarify those issues and derive at valid conclusions. In his attempt to reconcile these things, he developed something called the dialectic method. And the dialectic method became the principal scholastic tool of the medieval period. Basically, it involves binary questioning, yes-no kind of things. And if you take everything down and reduce it to its basic parts, you can find answers by getting yes and no, true and false type information. As a personality psychologist, I really appreciate Abelard's notions of nominalism versus realism. And we have to make sure still to this day that words are not to be confused with things. Words represent things. Words are labels for things. But many words, even in our culture today, carry much meaning. And Abelard said we have to watch out for that type of thing. We have to remember nominal, and remember your levels of analysis and measurement. Nominal is just labeling something, naming something. So naming it doesn't give it any kind of inherent qualities. In personality psychology, we work on having rigid operational definitions of words. So if I'm talking about introversion or extroversion or shyness or conscientiousness, I have an operational definition of what that word means. And it's extremely important in any area of science and personality where you can't see traits. It's even more critically important. So we should make sure that words only are used for their label. They're not used as real things. Words have no reality behind them, according to Abelard. Let me give you a case in point example. When I was growing up, they would show regularly on television, by regularly mean every day, Three Stooges shorts. I know the Three Stooges go in and out of favor. They were a little bit violent and they had their issues. But they did something to the science of intelligence theory that was not really cool. They used the words moron, idiot, and imbecile as slurs, as derogatory terms to describe people. Moron, imbecile, and idiot actually were, in the early 1900s, technical terms for below normal functioning of intelligence. And each one of those terms was defined by a band of IQ points. Now you might have issues with that, that's a whole nother story. But eventually researchers and scholars had to change the names moron, imbecile, and idiot because they came into the popular parlance as slurs. And you find that with lots of other technical scientific terms, especially in psychology. The new label oftentimes is a little bit more accurate, and for a while doesn't have any social stigma to it until somebody decides to put some things there. Our last idea from Abelard is conceptualism. And that gets back into that old Aristotelian idea about universals. And Abelard believed that universals were basically gained by using his dialectical method to show how similar things were, and then you could come up with a conception of something. So if I look at a dog, one of my favorite creatures to use as examples, I can talk about the characteristics that that dog has. If I'm looking at 5 other dogs, I can start making abstractions about dogs and the number of tails they have, the number of feet they have, what kind of vocalizations they make, things like that. So my universal may not fit every specific case, but it fits most of them, Now, here's the naughty bits, to quote Monty Python. And Abelard is probably the only scholar in this series of individuals to have had a 1980s R-rated late-night movie made after his exploits. And that movie was called Stealing Heaven. It was based on a novel by Marion Mead about the love story between Peter Abelard and Heloise. So let me tell you the good stuff here. So, Abelard was an up-and-coming scholar at the University of Notre Dame. But one thing that you didn't do was you didn't get married, because you had all the priests and religious folks with holy orders, and it kind of stunted your career as an academic if you were to get married. Well, why is this important? Well, being an up-and-comer, getting a lot of notice, there were a lot of people that wanted to bask in the reflected glory of Abelard. That's a Bob Cialdini social influence term. So one of the deacons, bureaucratic type person, who worked for the Notre Dame Cathedral, kind of wanted to ride on Abelard's coattails and get some extra status. He also had a niece who had this annoying tendency to want to learn things. And at the time, women were supposed to not learn things. But Heloise was, by all accounts, not only a breathtakingly beautiful young woman, but an extremely intelligent woman who read many books, read philosophy, could speak multiple languages. So, the deacon, wanting to up his status and take care of his annoying niece, now depending on whose account you read, his quote-unquote niece may have really been his daughter, was living in the house with the deacon, so the niece is there, and the deacon invites Abelard to stay at his place rent-free. A lot of us would like to live rent-free. There are strings, as there are strings with everything. The one condition was the deacon had Abelard give philosophy lessons to Heloise. Well, according to all accounts, the philosophy lessons soon turned into lovemaking sessions. And as happens with too much unprotected sex, somebody gets pregnant. And guess what? It wasn't Abelard. So Heloise becomes pregnant. Big disgrace to the deacon. He loses lots of face, lots of status. Furthermore, he thought that Heloise had extremely high mate value and that he could marry her into one of the noble houses of France. But now she's pregnant, so obviously not a virgin, lost her mate value. Well, supposedly Abelard and Heloise get secretly married, and instead of leaving Paris and moving someplace else where they could live happily ever after, they stayed in Paris. The deacon kicks Abelard out of his house, and Abelard gets an apartment. Heloise is disgraced. And in his anger, the deacon hires some thugs who break into Abelard's apartment one late night, pin him down on the floor, and castrate him. It's quite a heavy price to pay for a romantic dalliance. So Abelard had been equally disgraced and ended up in a monastery. Heloise went to a nunnery and had her baby. And the two supposedly wrote hot and heavy love letters to each other for the rest of their lives on Earth. So, great story there. Probably not one that you would expect in the middle of a discussion of a bunch of religious guys. But we have to have our juicy bits once in a while, don't we, folks? Couple more Aristotelian clerics. We have Albert Magnus, who reviews Aristotle's work and shows how rational powers reasoning, can bring salvation. He also makes important discoveries in botany, or the study of plants. Our last medieval scholar is St. Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas is the height of Aristotelian influence in the Catholic Church. He brings it into officialdom and synthesizes Aristotle's thought and Christianity. Aquinas says that reason and faith are not incompatible, and that all paths may lead to the truth. Following Abelard, he says that our senses provide information on particulars, not on universals. So when you look at Pippin, my dog, at the end of the video, in our little We Have Couches copyright clause, Pippin gives you some information about a particular dog, not all dogs, and not universal characteristics about dogs. So Aquinas kind of puts the senses in a reasonable place for examining these issues. So let's look at his influence. Aquinas divided faith and reason, made the study of nature respectable again, just when you thought it wasn't going to have a chance, and made argument over dogmatic church policies possible. I've saved this guy as our cleanup hitter to talk about medieval stuff, William of Occam. I find Occam one of my favorite philosophers of this era. He was a no-nonsense guy. If you were going to watch the old TV show or movie Dragnet, you'd be with Occam saying, just the facts, only the facts. Occam believed in the most parsimonious, or the simplest, explanations for all things. And Occam was finding that explanations for phenomena were getting extremely convoluted. People would add layers of things. When something didn't work, they tried to do that by making adjustments, trying to make a little fix here, a little fix there. And essentially you lost the basic issue. Occam, being a fantastic logician, is considered the founder of something called Occam's razor. And Occam's razor is the idea that you need to shave away extraneous assumptions about things and just look at the basic core issues. Occam was also a nominalist, mainly because he believed that common experiences should share common labels. So if we're going to call a canine a dog and we call a bunch of different canines dogs, well, it's only because they share the common label of dog. So some universals for William of Occam are okay, as long as they represent the experience and aren't just a word. Now, Occam gets represented in fiction in a novel in 1980 by the Italian author Umberto Eco, who wrote a book called The Name of the Rose, which is basically a medieval murder mystery that takes place in an Italian monastery. The lead character is an English monk who remarkably has characteristics similar to Occam. There was, in 2019, a Starz mini-series about the Eco book, Name of the Rose. And in 1986, Sean Connery, dressed in monk's robes, also tries to solve the murder mystery in the Italian monastery. That's my favorite treatment of it. You see Sean Connery as a problem-solving sleuth monk with a lot of kind of cool Sherlock Holmes type inventions of his day. The miniseries is pretty good too. Let me just finish on this. Here is a much better book by Umberto Eco, FOUCAULT'S Pendulum. FOUCAULT'S Pendulum is kind of a pre-Dan Brown murder mystery book with the Templars and the Masons and all those guys. I've tried to read Name of the Rose and it's just too dense for me, but I just bore through FOUCAULT'S Pendulum. So if you need some fun reading after you're done with this class, highly suggested novel. So, we finished off the Dark Ages through the medieval period. Quite a ride through those many years. In our next unit, we're going to look at the Renaissance and how Renaissance thinking shaped philosophy and later psychology. See you next time on the history of psychology. Bye now. This has been a We Have Couches video production. Copyright 2020. Professor Michael Botwin. All rights reserved.